It was a Saturday night in late spring, the kind of evening where the air felt heavy with warmth and the world seemed to slow down just enough to remind everyone of their place. The mansion stood at the edge of town, a sprawling estate of glass, marble, and sharp lines that made it seem more like a fortress than a home. Expensive cars lined the curved driveway, and inside, the sound of laughter, clinking glasses, and polished jazz filled the grand hall. To the outside world it was the picture of luxury, the kind of setting that only belonged to the rich, where every corner gleamed and every detail screamed money. But beneath the shine, there was something uneasy, something that lingered like smoke after a fire. The man at the center of it all was a millionaire who had made his fortune young, trading risks for glory, always playing with people the way others played cards. He had a reputation that followed him into every room he entered, charming, bold, but sharp-edged, with a taste for making people feel smaller than him. His friends, or the ones who kept him close, were much the same. They lived in his shadow, thriving off the scraps of his wealth and the glow of his power. Together, they filled the house with their voices, their mocking jokes, and the kind of arrogance that dripped from people who thought money made them untouchable. That night, the gathering was supposed to be nothing more than another display of his lifestyle, an endless table of food, an open bar, the kind of gathering where everyone dressed to be seen, men in tailored suits, women in glittering dresses, all of them desperate to prove they belonged in that room. The walls echoed with false compliments and forced smiles, but no one wanted to be the first to leave. No one wanted to risk missing something. The joke began the way many of his cruelest games began, casually, with a smirk. Somewhere between, in the third glass of whiskey and the endless stream of laughter, he mentioned her. The cleaning lady, a woman who had worked in silence for years, walking those marble floors in cheap shoes while carrying a quiet dignity that no one in that house could touch. She was black, poor by comparison, and invisible in the way the wealthy liked their workers to be, useful but forgettable. Yet something about her presence always stirred something in him. Not respect, not admiration, just the cruel thrill of seeing how far he could push the line. Imagine, he laughed to his friends, if she showed up here, at this party, dressed like she belonged. The room erupted in the kind of laughter that wasn't joyful but sharp, the kind that cut through people like a blade. They took turns adding to it, each suggestion nastier than the last, until someone dared him to actually invite her. He smirked, raised his glass, and promised he would. To them, it was a game. To him, it was another chance to humiliate someone he thought beneath him. What he didn't know, or maybe didn't care to notice, was that she wasn't the type to break. She had seen their whispers, their looks, the way they treated her like background noise. She had felt the weight of their power, the unspoken reminder that her place was always behind the scenes. But she also carried something else, a quiet resilience born from years of being underestimated. She was used to being ignored, but she was not used to being mocked. That night, while the mansion buzzed with false glamour, her world looked very different. Her apartment was small, lived in, filled with the scents of spices and the hum of an old fan. Her life was simple, but it was hers. Neighbors greeted her with warmth, her church friends spoke of her strength, and the children on her block looked up to her because she carried herself with pride. She wasn't rich, but she had something money couldn't buy, a sense of self that couldn't be stripped away. When the invitation came, slipped into her hand like a joke, she knew what it meant. The tone, the smirk, the laughter. It wasn't kindness. It wasn't respect. It was mockery dressed up as generosity. Most people in her place would have ignored it, maybe even feared it. But she didn't. She stared at the words, read them twice, and then placed the card on her table. Something in her heart told her this wasn't just about a party. This was about every time she had been treated as less. In the mansion, the guests didn't expect her to show. They waited, glasses in hand, ready for the cruel punchline. To them, it was already funny. The thought of her standing outside, out of place, too ashamed to walk in. But the night was far from over, and the cruel balance of power they thought they controlled was already beginning to shift, though none of them could see it yet. The scene was set, the wealthy circling their prey, their laughter echoing against me, marble floors, and a woman quietly deciding whether she would let herself be the butt of their joke or the one who turned it back on them. The air itself felt heavy, as if waiting for something to break, and in the stillness of that waiting, the first cracks of the night began to show. She arrived at the mansion later than anyone expected, and the delay only fueled the cruel anticipation. The guests had grown restless, waiting for the punchline, their laughter simmering just below the surface. When the heavy wooden doors finally opened and she walked in, silence spread across the hall like a sudden chill. No one had expected her to look the way she did. She wasn't in the uniform they knew her by, with her apron and rubber gloves. She had come dressed in deep emerald satin, a gown that shimmered with every step she took. Her hair was styled, her makeup flawless, her posture taller than anyone had ever seen her stand. She walked in not like a servant, but like a woman who belonged, as if the marble floors had been built for her. The silence broke into uneasy laughter, then whispers, then long stares. Some smirked, others blinked in surprise, but the man at the center of it all, the one who had made her an invitation into a weapon, felt his throat tighten. He had expected her to come looking out of place, foolish and embarrassed. But she wasn't embarrassed. She was glowing, commanding the room in a way no one had seen before. For the first time, his joke had slipped out of his control. It didn't take long for the tension to spread. A few guests tried to recover by treating her as if she were part of the entertainment, complimenting her appearance with tones dipped in sarcasm. But others, quietly unsettled, couldn't help but wonder what it meant that she was standing there so boldly. She accepted every word with a calm smile, never letting their mockery touch her. That composure cut deeper than any angry outburst could have. It made them feel small, and they hated it. The millionaire tried to laugh it off, raising his glass and making a toast that dripped with false charm. But there was a crack in his voice, a flicker in his eyes that betrayed his irritation. His friends noticed, and some of them, always eager to mimic his cruelty, pressed further. They asked her questions meant to expose her background, her lack of wealth, and her place in society. "Who designed your dress?" one woman sneered, expecting her to falter. But she simply said, "A friend who knows me better than anyone here knows themselves." Every reply was calm, but beneath it, there was fire. The guests shifted in their seats. As the evening dragged on, the atmosphere thickened. What began as laughter grew sharp, restless. The wealthy guests couldn't stand the shift in attention. She wasn't supposed to take up space in their world. She wasn't supposed to shine brighter than them. Jealousy crept into their whispers. The women, draped in diamonds, felt their sparkle dim beside her quiet confidence. The men, used to seeing her as someone who bent to their needs, now felt threatened by the way she ignored them. The millionaire himself wrestled with feelings he couldn't name. Part of him burned with humiliation, angry that his joke had turned on him. Yet another part was fascinated. She was different tonight. No longer the woman who silently scrubbed his flaws. She had become something he didn't know how to control, and that unsettled him more than he would admit. As the night deepened, drinks flowed faster, and words grew sharper. It was then that old wounds and hidden secrets began to seep into the open. One of his closest friends, drunk enough to forget his mask, muttered that the millionaire's fortune wasn't as solid as it looked, that behind the glass walls and marble, debts were piling up, deals were crumbling. The whispers grew, guests leaning closer to each other, their eyes flicking back to the man whose empire was supposed to be untouchable. He brushed it off with forced laughter, but the air had shifted again. Now he wasn't just fighting her presence, he was fighting his own slipping power. The cleaning lady, now seated at the edge of the room, noticed every glance, every hushed word. She had spent years invisible, but invisibility makes a person sharp. She saw his pride unraveling, the fear behind his smirk, the way his friends watched him with less admiration and more suspicion. And somewhere in her chest, a strange mix of pity and anger grew. She hadn't come here to destroy him, but she also wasn't about to save him from himself. As the night pushed on, another layer unfolded. An older woman, one of the millionaire's longtime friends, slipped into conversation with her. Unlike the others, this woman didn't speak with venom but with curiosity, almost warning. She whispered of how many people had been hurt by his games, how many lives he had twisted for his amusement. Her words carried the weight of something personal, a past wound she couldn't forget. The cleaning lady listened, her face calm, but inside she felt a storm rise. The man she had worked for all these years wasn't just arrogant. He was cruel in ways she had only glimpsed. The millionaire, watching from across the room, grew restless. The sight of her surrounded by his guests, commanding their attention, unsettled him more than he could stand. He began to push harder, making jokes that weren't funny, pressing questions that cut too deep. He asked about her family, her struggles, her place in the world, trying to strip away her dignity. Each question was a strike meant to remind her where she came from. But each time she answered with grace, never letting him see her flinch. The crowd grew quieter, their laughter thinner. They could feel the weight in the air now, the way the game had shifted into something darker. By midnight, the party no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like a standoff. The guests stayed because leaving would mean missing the fallout, and no one wanted to miss the moment when the tension finally snapped. The millionaire's pride was hanging by a thread, his friends restless, his secrets slipping into the open. The cleaning lady stood taller than she ever had, her presence a silent challenge to everything they believed about class, race, and power. What no one knew yet was how much deeper the night would go. The whispers of debt weren't the only truth hanging over him. There were deals tied to dangerous people, alliances built on lies, and enemies waiting for a crack in his armor. His obsession with control, his desperate need to be the center of power, had made him reckless. And now, with a room full of witnesses watching him unravel in front of the one woman he thought beneath him, the cracks were becoming impossible to hide. Every laugh that slipped from her lips, every calm response she gave, was another thread pulled from the fabric of his power. And in the fragile balance of that night, with envy burning in the eyes of his guests, humiliation clawing at his pride, and old grudges rising to the surface something dangerous was building. The air itself seemed to pulse with it, as if the walls of the mansion were waiting, listening, knowing that the night was moving toward a point where nothing could be undone. The clock had just passed 1 in the morning when the mansion began to suffocate under the weight of its own silence. The guests were still there, lingering not out of joy, but because something in the air had rooted them in place. Every glance, every whisper carried the same uneasy thought. The party was no longer a party. It had turned into a battlefield where power, pride, and humiliation hung sharp and ready to cut. The millionaire stood in the center of it all, his jaw tight, his smile long gone. His whiskey glass trembled slightly in his hand, though he tried to mask it as confidence. Across the room she stood calm, her green satin dress catching the chandelier's light, her back straight, as if the entire weight of their mockery had never touched her. That composure ate at him more than anything. He wanted to see her break. He wanted to see her crumble the way he had imagined from the start. Instead, she stood taller, stronger, and in that strength, he felt his entire world turning against him. It began with words, but words sharpened into weapons. He raised his voice, mocking her in front of the crowd, demanding to know why she had come, who she thought she was. "You think you belong here? Among us?" His laughter was harsh, not the charming sound they were used to, but bitter, cracking. She didn't answer right away. She looked at him, steady, her silence a mirror reflecting everything he didn't want to see. The guests shifted uncomfortably, caught between loyalty and unease, their eyes darting between the two of them, as if watching a storm roll in. Then she spoke, and her words sliced through the tension like glass breaking. She told him the truth he had spent years hiding, that his wealth was nothing without the people who held him up. That respect couldn't be bought, and that even in a room full of diamonds, dignity was the rarest thing of all. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear, and it carried into every corner of the room. For a moment, there was silence, heavy and undeniable. Something inside him snapped. The humiliation, the whispers of his debts, the eyes of his guests watching him lose control. It all boiled into rage. He lunged toward her, his glass shattering against the floor as his hand reached for her arm. Gasps filled the air. Some guests stepped back, others froze, unsure whether to intervene. She pulled away, her gown twisting with the sudden movement, but his grip tightened. His face was twisted, not in control anymore, not charming or powerful, just desperate. The struggle was quick but violent. She tried to push him off, but his strength and fury overpowered his reason. In the chaos, a candle stand tipped, flames licking dangerously close to the drapes. Someone screamed, but the sound was drowned by the crash of bodies against furniture. Glass shattered, plates broke, and the entire room erupted in panic. In the heat of it, something irreversible happened. Whether it was a shove too hard, a blow struck in blind anger, or the sick twist of an accident, her body hit the floor with a sound that silenced everything else. The guests froze. The millionaire staggered back, his chest heaving, his hands trembling as he looked down at what he had done. She lay still, her once commanding presence now motionless against the marble. The green satin of her dress fanned out around her, the shimmer now haunting in the dim light. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the faint crackle of the candle, flames climbing the curtains. Then panic ripped through the room. Some guests screamed, others rushed to the door, their heels and shoes slipping against the polished floors. A few knelt, trying to shake her, their voices trembling with pleas for her to wake. But she didn't stir. The millionaire dropped to his knees, his face pale, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for words. His pride, his arrogance, everything that had defined him was gone in an instant. All that remained was fear. The fear of what he had done. The fear of losing everything. He muttered that it wasn't supposed to happen, that it was just an argument, that she pushed him first. His words tumbled out in fragments, desperate to rewrite what everyone had just seen. But the guests weren't blind. They had watched the rage in his eyes, the way he had grabbed her, the way his pride had turned into violence. Some of them turned away, unwilling to look at him. Others stared with shock and disgust. A few pulled out their phones, their hands shaking, but were quickly stopped by others who feared what would happen if the story left the mansion walls. The immediate aftermath was chaos layered with denial. The millionaire's closest allies rushed to him, whispering frantically, urging him to stay calm, to think. "It was an accident," one hissed in his ear. "She fell. You didn't mean it." They tried to reframe the scene, to reshape it into something less damning, but the blood seeping onto the marble, the stillness of her body, the haunted faces of the guests, told a truth that no one could erase. The room grew thick with smoke as the flames from the toppled candle crept higher, licking across the curtains until sparks began to fall. The chaos doubled, guests screaming as they rushed to escape both the fire and the crime that now stained the mansion forever. Some stumbled over broken glass, others dragged each other toward the door, their elegant clothes torn and smeared with spilled wine. The perfect image of wealth and control had disintegrated into pure panic. He stood frozen, torn between rushing to her side and fleeing with the others. His hands hovered in the air, stained from the struggle, trembling as though they belonged to someone else. In his head, fragments of thought collided. Regret, rage, fear. But one thing became painfully clear. Nothing would ever return to the way it was. By the time the flames were doused and the mansion was cleared, the truth of that night was carved into every soul who had been there. No matter how much he or his friends tried to rewrite the story, no matter how they spun it to sound like an accident, the image of him standing over her broken body would not fade. It was burned into their minds, just like the smoke that clung to the shattered remains of the house. The fire had been put out quickly, but the smoke lingered in the mansion like an unshakable memory. The air reeked of burnt fabric and spilled alcohol, and the shattered glass still glittered on the marble, as if mocking the illusion of glamour that had once filled the place. The guests who had fled returned in small, hesitant steps, their whispers trailing like ghosts. Some refused to look at the spot on the floor where she had fallen, while others stared at it as if trapped, unable to accept that the woman who had walked in so proudly only hours ago was gone. The millionaire sat slumped in a chair, his shirt wrinkled, his tie torn loose, his eyes hollow. He didn't look like the man who had commanded attention when the night began. He looked like someone stripped bare, exposed in a way he had spent his life avoiding. His friends surrounded him, whispering, coaxing, their voices sharp with panic. They told him to calm down, to remember who he was, to use his wealth to control the story before it spun out of reach. But no matter how much they tried to convince him, his hands kept trembling. His voice cracked when he muttered the same words again and again. "I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it." Some of the guests wanted to leave and never speak of it again. Others felt trapped, as though being in that house had already marked them. A few argued over whether to call the police immediately or to wait, fearful of what it would mean to be tied to the scandal. But the truth was undeniable. Too many people had seen. Too many eyes had witnessed the rage in his face, the force in his grip, the silence that followed when her body hit the marble. There was no erasing it. When the authorities finally arrived, the house had fallen into a strange quiet. The police stepped onto the marble floors with heavy boots, their voices curt, their questions cutting through the haze. The millionaire tried to stand tall again, tried to summon the charm that had carried him through countless negotiations and public appearances. But charm couldn't hide the redness in his eyes, the blood on his cuff, the way his voice cracked when he insisted it was an accident. The officers didn't argue with him, but they didn't believe him either. They led him away while the guests stood frozen, watching the man who had once been untouchable shrink under the weight of flashing lights. The cleaning lady's body was carried out quietly, covered, but the sight of it broke through the whispers and brought a hush to the crowd outside the mansion gates. Neighbors had gathered, drawn by the smoke and the chaos, and when the truth began to spread, when they learned who had died and where, it struck like lightning. The story of a millionaire's party would have been gossip on its own, but the story of a cleaning woman mocked and humiliated only to end the night lifeless carried a deeper sting. It was the kind of story that couldn't be hidden. In the days that followed, the media descended on the estate like vultures. Headlines screamed of arrogance, cruelty, and downfall. Pictures of the mansion on fire appeared on every screen, while old photos of the cleaning lady, smiling at a church gathering, laughing with children on her street, circulated alongside them. The contrast was stark. Her quiet dignity against his loud wealth, her life of simplicity against his empire of excess. Public opinion began to form quickly, and it was not in his favor. The millionaire's lawyers worked day and night, crafting statements, pushing the narrative of a tragic accident. They spoke of how emotions had run high, how no harm was ever intended, how everyone in the room had been drinking. They tried to paint him as a man caught in an unfortunate moment, not a man consumed by pride and cruelty. But the witnesses told their stories, and their words painted a very different picture. They spoke of his taunts, his rage, the way his voice broke into shouting when he felt mocked. They spoke of her composure, her quiet strength, the way she refused to break under his attempts to humiliate her. The public listened, and the sympathy tilted further away from him with every passing day. Her community grieved in a way the mansion's walls could never contain. The small church where she had spent her Sundays overflowed with mourners. Neighbors lit candles outside her apartment, children left flowers by her door, and people who had known her only in passing spoke of her kindness, her resilience, the way she carried herself with pride even when life gave her little. For them, her death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a symbol, a reminder of how easily the powerful preyed on the powerless, and how dignity could still threaten those who feared it most. The emotional toll on the guests who had been there lingered like a shadow. Some of them woke in the middle of the night, hearing the sound of her fall, replaying it in their minds. Others carried guilt for not stepping in, for watching the fight escalate and doing nothing until it was too late. The women who had laughed at her entrance found their reflections harder to face. The men who had joined in the mockery now avoided each other's eyes, ashamed of their silence. The party that had been meant as another show of wealth had left everyone scarred, a reminder of how easily cruelty could turn into catastrophe. For the millionaire, the fall was the hardest. His name, once tied to luxury and charm, now sat in every headline alongside words like rage and murder. Business partners pulled away, deals fell apart, and the empire he had built began to crumble. But it wasn't the loss of money that haunted him. It was the memory of her eyes, calm and unshaken, staring at him in those final moments before his rage boiled over. No matter how many statements his lawyers crafted, no matter how many spins his friends tried to put on the story, that look stayed with him. It was a mirror he could never escape. The trial loomed like a storm. The prosecution built its case with the testimonies of witnesses, the photographs of the scene, and the timeline of events that left little room for doubt. His defense team clung to the argument of an accident, of a heated moment gone wrong. But the world beyond the courtroom had already judged him. The court of public opinion had no patience for excuses, and every article, every televised report, painted him as the man who killed not just a woman, but the very idea of respect in his house of wealth. In the quiet aftermath, as weeks stretched into months, the ripple effects continued. Her family struggled with grief, but also with the sudden, unexpected spotlight. Reporters knocked on their doors, strangers sent letters of sympathy, and activists spoke her name at rallies, tying her story to the broader fight for dignity and justice. Her life, once so ordinary in the eyes of the world, became a symbol that reached far beyond the walls of the mansion where it had ended. The mansion itself stood silent after that night, its windows dark, its halls empty. Neighbors passed by and whispered, pointing at the place that had once been a beacon of wealth, but now sat heavy with shame. Some said they could still smell the smoke. Others swore the house looked smaller, as though stripped of the arrogance that had built it. Whatever the truth, no one saw it as a place of power anymore. It was a ruin dressed in marble, a reminder of how quickly pride could turn to ash. The crime had left scars on everyone it touched, but the deepest was the reminder that no amount of wealth could shield a man from the truth of what he had done. He could buy lawyers, spin headlines, and silence witnesses, but he couldn't erase the memory of that night, the sound of her fall, or the sight of her dignity standing taller than his empire ever had. That was the true aftermath. The reality that the power he once wielded had been stripped away not by a rival or a deal gone wrong, but by a woman he had thought beneath him, who had left this world as the one thing he could never be, unbroken. The trial became the final stage of the story, and by the time it opened, the world already thought it knew the ending. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, cameras lining the steps outside. The millionaire walked in dressed in a sharp suit, but the suit did little to restore the power he once carried. His face looked worn, his hair thinner, his eyes heavy. He had once been the man who walked into a room and owned it, but now he was just another defendant, waiting for judgment. Witnesses spoke one by one, their voices steady, even as his defense team tried to twist their words. They described the rage in his face, the way his hand had tightened on her arm, the way his voice had broken into shouting when she refused to bow to him. The cleaning lady's story unfolded not through her own words, but through the memories of others. The strength she carried into that room, the quiet dignity that silenced their mockery, and the stillness that followed her fall. Each testimony chipped away at the story his lawyers tried to sell. The verdict came after weeks of arguments, but the moment itself felt strangely quiet. He was found guilty, not of premeditation, but of manslaughter, a crime born of rage and humiliation. Some thought the sentence too light, others thought it at least a measure of justice. He was led away in handcuffs, his face pale, his shoulders slumped, no longer the man who had once thrown parties in marble halls. For him, the fall was complete. His fortune was fractured, his reputation destroyed, his freedom taken. All that remained was the memory of what he had done and the silence of the life he had ended. Her family sat in the courtroom during the sentencing, their faces a mixture of grief and quiet relief. Justice could not bring her back, but it gave her dignity in death, a recognition of the wrong done to her. They carried her memory home with them, back to the neighborhood that had loved her, back to the church that had overflowed with mourners. In their grief, they found strength in knowing her story had reached beyond their walls. Strangers now knew her name. Strangers spoke of her with respect. She had become more than just a worker in someone else's house. She had become a symbol of resilience against cruelty. The community that had once overlooked her began to see her life in a different light. Her story made its way into conversations about class and race, about the invisible labor that held up the lives of the wealthy, about the cruelty of those who thought themselves above others. Her death became a reminder of how fragile dignity could seem in the face of power, yet also how unbreakable it truly was. She had walked into that mansion as a joke in their eyes, but she had left it as the only one who stood unbroken, even in her final moments. The broader impact of the case rippled outward. Newspapers debated what it said about wealth and justice, whether the sentence was enough, and whether society would have reacted differently if the roles had been reversed. Activists pointed to her death as part of a larger story, one of countless lives dismissed, silenced, or overlooked. Some called for stronger protections for workers, others for deeper conversations about the arrogance of power and the way it blinds those who hold it. The case was not just about one man and one woman anymore. It became a mirror held up to society, forcing people to see what they often chose to ignore. For those who had been at the party, the aftermath never truly ended. They carried the meat, Maury with them, each in different ways. Some avoided speaking of it altogether, burying it under layers of silence. Others confessed their guilt in private, ashamed of their laughter, their complicity, their inaction. The mansion itself was eventually sold, but it never regained its old glory. To those who knew its history, it remained a hollow place, haunted not by ghosts, but by shame. The millionaire spent his years behind bars trying to convince himself it had been an accident. He told himself he hadn't meant for her to die, that it was just a moment of weakness, that anyone could have lost control. But no matter how many times he repeated it, he couldn't erase the memory of her calm eyes, of the silence in the room when she spoke the truth he couldn't bear to hear. He realized too late that the real crime wasn't just in the fall itself. It was in the years of arrogance that had led him there, the belief that he could play with people's lives as if they were his toys. His punishment wasn't just the prison walls. It was the knowledge that he had destroyed himself with his own pride. In the end, the story became less about him and more about her. The woman who had been invisible in life became unforgettable in death. Her story was told in classrooms, in church sermons, in community meetings. It lived on in conversations about justice and dignity, in the reminder that even those the world tries to ignore can hold a strength that outshines wealth and power. Justice, in its imperfect way, had been served. The man who thought himself untouchable was touched by the law, by shame, by the very society he had once looked down upon. But the deeper justice came in the shift of perspective, in the way her life forced others to see the truths they had ignored. The story left behind questions that could not be easily answered. How much of what happened was about one man's cruelty, and how much was about a system that allowed him to believe he could get away with it? How many others lived in the shadows of power, unseen, unheard, waiting for someone to recognize their worth? What remained was reflection. Reflection on how easily pride could turn to violence, how laughter could turn to cruelty, how power without empathy could destroy not just lives but entire communities. It was a story about human weakness, but also about human strength. The strength of a woman who refused to be broken, even when the world tried to make her a joke. Her name lived on, not as a punchline, but as a reminder. That dignity is the one thing money cannot buy, and the one thing power cannot erase. And in the end, that truth was stronger than marble floors, stronger than smoke-filled halls, stronger even than death itself.